So there were nationwide protests that happened on Monday, and you could be forgiven for not knowing that because they were basically completely ignored by the mainstream media on TV. So this is from USA Today. They say, several thousand fast food and other low-wage workers in nearly 50 cities took part in demonstrations Monday to renew their demand for a $15 minimum wage and the right to join a union. The protests in Boston, Chicago, Oakland, Detroit, St. Louis, and other cities marked the 50th anniversary of the Memphis sanitation worker strike, the centerpiece of Martin Luther King Jr.'s Poor People's Campaign. The workers sought civil rights and better working conditions after two of their co-workers were crushed to death by a malfunctioning garbage truck. Most of Monday's demonstrations occurred during the lunch hour at fast food restaurants, but in Memphis they culminated in a late afternoon march from Claiborne Temple to Memphis City Hall, the same route the sanitation workers walked a half-century ago. So, isn't that strange? You have thousands of fast food and other low-wage workers in 50 cities say, okay, we're going to stand up and continue the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., literally, with the Poor People's Campaign, and they march the same route that they did back then, and I didn't hear a goddamn peep from corporate media. I didn't hear a peep. Now, so this story is interesting just based on what actually happened, but it's also interesting to look at it in the context of media coverage of other protests. So you guys remember, because it wasn't that long ago, we had a bunch of assholes with tiki torches protesting the fact that a Confederate monument was about to be taken down. What a thing to care about. I mean, can you imagine being so mad that they're going to take down the statue of a Confederate soldier or a Confederate general, an army that represented the enslavement of black people, and you're so angry that you're going to protest the removal of that statue? I mean, that's like, I can't believe you're going to take down Himmler's statue. That's so wrong. I'm so offended. It's about history, not about hate. It's about history. This statue of Stalin should stay up because it's about history, not about hate. Weird how that argument people only find compelling in one instance when it comes to the Confederacy. But you had a bunch of assholes in tiki torches, with tiki torches, protesting a Confederate monument, wearing Dockers, screaming "White Lives Matter" and "Jews will not replace us." This got endless media coverage, hyperventilating media coverage, and it was viewed as like the biggest protest ever. Meanwhile, this Fight for 15 protest dwarfs that protest. Not a peep in the mainstream media. Not a peep. And you know what? You don't even have to use the example of the alt-right assholes. You can use the example of the Tea Party. Many Tea Party protests had way fewer participants than the Fight for 15 protests, and that got way more coverage. Way more coverage. And you know what? The right-wing media bolstered those Tea Party protests because they would act like it was the biggest protest ever, and they would cover it for half the day, and the host would talk about how wonderful it is that they're fighting for this. Meanwhile, where was CNN and MSNBC for these protests? It's almost like so-called left-wing media is not left-wing media, and it's the Democratic Party Apologetics Network, and right-wing media is actually right-wing media. That's what it's like. So you have right-wing media, which is just so deeply mired in Republican politics and doing propaganda for the Republican Party, but also pushing far right-wing ideology. And then you have the Democratic network, which is just a Democratic network, not a left-wing network, not a social democracy network or a democratic socialism network. They don't represent an actual ideology. They represent doing rah-rah for Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and Hillary Clinton. So, and that's why you don't get serious coverage over this. Man, this should have been like the #1 story. And remember, I'm talking about, this was before the mass shooting, to be clear. So This should have been wall-to-wall coverage. And you should have had anchors down there interviewing the people. Hey, tell me your story. What's your name? What's your life like? How many jobs do you work? How many kids do you have? How hard is it to pay the rent every month? Learn about what's happening with these people, but they don't do it because they don't care. They grandfather in the idea of wage slavery to how our system functions. Oh, you work full-time, but you don't make enough money to survive? Well, then maybe that's your own fault. How the fuck can that be somebody's own fault? They're already working full-time. What the fuck else do you want from them? They work full-time, but they don't make enough money to survive. They work full-time, but they don't make enough money to survive. Okay, I'm not a genius or anything, but that seems to me to be a problem with the fucking system, not with the individual. The individual's doing all they can. It's the system that says fuck you to that individual. And that's why they're protesting. And by the way, you want to talk about an issues-based protest. You know what they said? The protests in all the different places around the country, here were their demands. $15 minimum wage, right to join a union. That's it. We want a $15 minimum wage and a right to join a union. That's it. Simple, straightforward, undoubtedly correct, and would help so many people across this country. And for everybody, we can't afford a $15 minimum wage. Really? Go talk to everybody in Australia. What do they have? It's $17 or $18 right now, their minimum wage. Is Australia a hellscape that nobody wants to live in? No. So the idea it can't work, a minimum wage, it's just bullshit. Of course it can. Of course it could work. And you're also not having wage slavery anymore if that's the case. Unions, for example. Unions were at their peak in the U.S., during what's called the golden age of economic expansion. You were more likely to have a middle-class job and stay in the middle class when unions were strong in America. Now, you can have other arguments against unions about, hey, well, there are some downsides to it, and that's fine to have that conversation. I don't begrudge that conversation at all. But at the end of the day, the fact remains that when unions are strong, the middle class is strong. We have these so-called right-to-work laws in a lot of states now, a lot of red states. Really, they should be called right to work for less, because workers in those states earn, on average, about $1,500 to $2,000 less per year, and they have worse benefits. So what I need everybody to understand is we have answers to a lot of these questions. Hey, how do we make the middle class stronger? How do we improve our country? And the people who are doing Fight for 15, they're correct about a lot of this stuff. And they're doing a very important movement here, and there's blackout across the board in corporate media. And that's the problem. Just the revolution will not be televised. Well, it is going to be televised right here on the internet, and we're not going to shut up about it, and we're going to let you know about what's happening, because I always told you guys from the beginning, and this was the case with Justice Democrats and any movement that's really trying to bring uncorrupted politicians to the forefront. Indifference is a bigger enemy than hatred. So, you can give bad coverage. You could give bad coverage to any of these actors, whether it's the unions, whether it's the Fight for 15 movement, whether it's a politician that's uncorrupted. The negative coverage is actually going to help them in the long run, because what happened is you just let their name out. And when you let their name out, people aren't just going to take your framing of the issue and go say, okay, I guess that's what the reality is. No, they're going to do research. So, for example, Allison Hartson. They can shit on Allison Hartson all they want, but when people actually do the research, they go, oh my God, this is a great candidate. She's for Medicare for all. She's for free college. She's for a living wage. She wants to end the war. She wants to legalize marijuana. She wants to get the money out of politics. And so in an attempt to downplay her, you actually made her stronger. But now the corporate media seems to have caught on to that. And maybe they learned it from Trump. Hey, we shit on Trump 24/7, and then he won. So just the fact that you talked about him ended up helping him, even though most of the coverage was negative. By the same token, people who are actually correct and who are going to help working people, now they've realized, oh, just don't cover them at all. Just don't cover them. If you just don't cover them, well, then that's the way that they're not going to get as much momentum. Because if they covered us and gave us negative coverage, people would see through their bullshit and they would go, why are you shitting on people who just want a living wage? What the fuck is wrong with you? And then the movement would become stronger. So now it's on us to get the word out. But I just need everybody to understand the state of affairs as it exists right now, because I've never seen anything this ridiculous. Again, I want to repeat this. Several thousand fast food and low-wage workers in nearly 50 cities relaunched a Poor People's Campaign, fighting for $15 minimum wage, fighting for the right to join a union, not just a public sector union, but a private sector union. They marched, many of the people marched the same route that the civil rights workers marched back in the day, and that Martin Luther King marched back in the day. You would think that's a newsworthy story. Hey, look, we're carrying on the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. They all pretended that the media was like, oh, we love Martin Luther King Jr. back on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, but when people actually fight for the issues he would be fighting on today, shh. So that's how ridiculous this is. The indifference is on purpose to not bolster your movement. That's what it is. But we need to fight back, and we need to get the word out on the internet and on social media. And that's the way we win. Because, again, the revolution will not be televised, at least not in the mainstream, not on corporate media. So we have to find other ways.